It was the kind of morning where the Kansas sun hung low, casting long shadows over the gravel auction lot as dust kicked up in the dry breeze. The kind of morning where the world felt quiet, its pace dictated by an old man with weathered hands and tired eyes. He pulled his '93 Ford pickup into a spot near the front, its rusty red body and faded paint job standing out among the newer, shinier trucks that dominated the lot. The truck wheezed and sputtered, a few groans of effort escaping its engine as it came to a halt. It was a vehicle that had seen more than its fair share of miles, and a lifetime's worth of memories. A truck that had served its owner well, hauling hay, carrying farm equipment, and being a constant companion through seasons of work and quiet moments of reflection. Emmett Granger, 81, stepped out slowly, the motion stiff but deliberate. He adjusted his faded army cap, a well-worn piece of cloth that bore the insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group. The cap was a little too small for his thick head of white hair, but it had become part of his identity. It had weathered the years with him, just as his body had weathered the passage of time. Muddy boots crunched on the gravel beneath him as he closed the door of his truck, his gait uneven due to an old war wound, a shrapnel injury that flared up when the weather changed. But that was something he didn't talk about. It was just one of the many things that made him the man he was, a man who had seen far more than most people could ever comprehend, and had quietly accepted the cost of those experiences. The auction lot was busy. Younger men circled the vehicles, kicking tires and checking under hoods with the air of men who knew what they were doing. At least, that's what they wanted everyone to think. Their voices bounced off the concrete walls of the lot as they laughed and joked among themselves. They were the type to show off, to make sure everyone saw how knowledgeable they were about trucks and engines and whatever else they thought was important. Emmett didn't mind. He had learned long ago that people who made a lot of noise often had the least to say. He took a slow, measured breath as he surveyed the lot. His eyes drifted over the row of trucks, some of them new, some of them not so much. There was a time when he would have been more concerned with the condition of the vehicles. But now, it was less about the trucks and more about the memories they stirred up. He had come for one truck in particular, a 2011 Ram 2500. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, dependable, a truck that could keep a small farm running through one more winter. And that's exactly what he needed. Emmett Granger had always been a man of purpose. He had been a soldier in Vietnam, a farmer, a father, and a husband. His hands had held M16 rifles in the jungle heat of Southeast Asia, delivered calves on moonlit nights during Kansas storms, and buried both a wife and a son in the ground he had worked his whole life to cultivate. The pain of those losses had long since been buried deep inside him, locked away behind a wall of stoic composure. But every now and then, a memory would break through, a flash of his son's face, or the smell of his wife's perfume. Those were the moments when the years seemed to fall away, and the weight of time pressed down on him. He walked toward the trucks with purpose, his boots leaving imprints in the dust, each step deliberate, like the ticking of a clock marking the passage of time. He didn't hurry, he didn't need to. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, a calm that came from having seen so much and learned so little had the power to unsettle him. He had earned that calm through years of service and sacrifice, through facing down the hardest challenges life could throw at him and simply continuing to move forward. As Emmett approached the 2011 Ram, he ran his hand along its silver fender. The truck was clean but not pristine, a vehicle that had seen work but hadn't been broken by it. It was practical, just like him. No flashy chrome or unnecessary luxuries. It was the kind of truck that worked as hard as the man who drove it, and that's exactly what he needed. His fingers traced the curves of the fender, feeling the rough texture beneath his calloused fingertips. It was sturdy, solid, dependable, just like the land he had worked his whole life. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the truck as if it were an old friend. There was no rush. The auction hadn't started yet. The world around him was still moving in a way that felt detached, like he was watching it through a fogged window. But inside that moment, he was fully present. Just him, the truck, and the memories that clung to the air like the dust swirling around his boots. It was then that a voice broke through the stillness. "Hey, Grandpa, you lost? This ain't the cattle barn." Emmett didn't flinch. He didn't turn around or acknowledge the man who had spoken. The voice came from behind him, a mocking tone laced with the kind of arrogance that came from a man who thought his youth made him superior. Emmett knew that kind of arrogance well. It was the same attitude he had seen in some of the younger soldiers back in Vietnam, The ones who thought they knew everything but had no idea what it really meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. A few people nearby chuckled at the remark, and Emmett could feel the eyes of the crowd turning toward him. But he didn't react. He simply continued to stand by the truck, his gaze fixed on the vehicle as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. The laughter continued, a low rumble that echoed across the lot, but Emmett didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that laughter was often the defense of those who were afraid to face the truth. Another voice joined in. "He probably thinks these trucks run on corn," someone said, their words laced with mockery. But still, Emmett didn't react. He had long since learned that the opinions of others didn't define him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had spent his life serving his country, working the land, and raising a family. His worth wasn't defined by the opinions of strangers. It was something deeper, something that could never be mocked or diminished. He adjusted his veteran's cap, the insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group barely visible beneath the worn fabric. It was a simple cap, but to Emmett, it was everything. It represented the men he had served with, the sacrifices they had made, and the bonds they had shared. It was a symbol of who he was, a soldier, a father, a man who had walked through the fire and come out the other side still standing. And so, he stood there, waiting. Not for the auction to begin, but for the world around him to remember what it had forgotten. To remember that some things, some people, couldn't be dismissed so easily. And when the time came, they would be reminded. The auctioneer, a man in his 40s with an air of practiced confidence, had been circling the lot for the past hour, making small talk with the bidders and checking his notes. He was the sort of person who had found comfort in the rhythm of auctions, where every word had its place, every gesture preordained. He stood on the platform now, clipboard in hand, scanning the lot for the vehicles that would begin the bidding. The sun was high, casting harsh shadows across the gravel, making the landscape seem almost too bright, as though reality itself were a little too sharp. He adjusted his microphone and raised his voice, calling the attention of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing across the lot. "We have 37 vehicles today, and we'll start with this 2015 Ford F-150. Excellent condition, only 42,000 miles. Plenty of life left in her, folks. Let's start the bidding at $25,000. There was a sudden shift in the atmosphere as the crowd surged forward, eager to take part in the fast-paced dance of bidding. The Ford was a hot ticket, no doubt. Young farmers and ranchers with deep pockets and lofty dreams wanted to get in on the action. Their hands shot up almost immediately, signals of intent, of power, of desire. But Emmett didn't move. He simply stood, still and silent, beside the ram, his eyes now fixed on the truck like an old soldier preparing for battle. His calm demeanor was an odd contrast to the frenetic energy around him. The auctioneer's voice became a blur, a constant hum in the background, but it didn't register with Emmett. He had seen enough auctions in his time to know how they worked. This was just another circus of men with too much money and too little understanding. He wasn't here to get caught up in the excitement. As the first vehicle was sold and the auctioneer moved to the next one, Emmett continued his silent vigil by the truck, his mind turning over the decision he had come here to make. This wasn't just about buying a truck, it was about something deeper. It was about reclaiming control over his life, making a decision on his own terms, without the interference of people who didn't understand what it meant to be a man of honor. The auction had begun, but for Emmett, the real test was yet to come. As the minutes passed, Emmett's presence at the auction started to draw attention. At first, the crowd had ignored him. After all, he was just another old man with a truck, another relic of a bygone era. But as the bidding continued, the whispers started. People began to take notice, but not for the right reasons. A few men began to gather around him, their eyes scanning him with a sense of superiority, of judgment. "That guy still thinks he's got it," one man muttered to his friend, his voice loud enough for Emmett to hear. "He's probably just here to watch the auction," came the reply. "He's not really serious. Those old clunkers don't stand a chance next to these modern rigs." Laughter followed, quiet but audible, the kind that makes a person feel like they're being weighed and found wanting. Emmett didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of talk before. It wasn't new. The world was full of men who thought that their success, their wealth, made them better than others. But Emmett knew something they didn't, that a man's worth was never tied to the money in his pocket or the truck he drove. It was about who he was at the core. And these men, standing there with their pressed jeans and brand-new boots, hadn't learned that lesson yet. The crowd grew larger as the bidding picked up. Some of the younger men made a point to approach Emmett, leaning in close as if to get a better look at the old man who had become the subject of their jokes. One man, a heavy-set dealer wearing a polo shirt and sunglasses, looked at Emmett and shook his head with a chuckle. "Betty pays in nickels," he said loudly, clearly not caring who heard him. The group of men around him laughed, a few of them joining in with their own jabs at Emmett's expense. But still, Emmett didn't react. He kept his gaze fixed on the ram, his fingers now tracing the edge of the truck's doorframe as though it were the most important thing in the world. He was not here to entertain anyone or to prove anything to anyone. He was here for something far more personal. As the bidding reached higher and higher levels, the auction began to get more chaotic. A young auction attendant, probably in his 20s, approached Emmett with a clipboard in hand. His expression was one of mild annoyance, and his tone carried the faintest hint of condescension. "Sir, maybe you should step back a bit," the attendant said, his voice clipped. "We're about to start the real bidding." Emmett looked at the young man for a moment, his blue eyes steady and unblinking. The man's words were dismissive, meant to push him aside, to marginalize him in a way that society often did to men like him. But Emmett didn't flinch. He had spent his entire life navigating the judgments of others, and this young man, with his clipboard and his uniform, was just another fleeting character in the long story of his life. "I am a real bidder, son," Emmett replied quietly, his voice clear and direct. There was no anger in it, no frustration, just calm certainty. The attendant blinked, clearly not expecting such a response. "Right. Sure," he said, his skepticism dripping through his words. "Just try not to get in anyone's way, okay?" Emmett gave a single nod, a small acknowledgment of the man's words. And then, without another glance, he turned back to the ram, continuing his silent inspection of the truck. His mind was focused, not on the young man or the laughter surrounding him, but on the vehicle in front of him. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to make a decision, and he wasn't going to let anyone distract him from it. Wade Michaels, a rancher in his 60s who had been in the business of cattle for over 30 years, had been watching Emmett from the corner of his eye. Unlike the younger men around him, Wade had seen enough of life to know better than to judge someone based on appearances alone. He had seen men like Emmett before, men who carried their histories with them, who didn't need to boast about what they had done or who they had been. Wade had been around long enough to know the weight a single man could carry. And he had heard whispers about Emmett Granger. The name had come up more than once in the stories that had circulated over the years. Wade had learned that sometimes the quietest man in the room was the one who commanded the most respect. Wade pulled out his phone and stepped to the side, making a call. His voice dropped low as he spoke, his words measured. "He's here," Wade said when the call connected. "At the Salina equipment auction. Getting the same treatment as last time." He paused as the voice on the other end responded. "No, sir," Wade continued. "He hasn't said a word to them." Wade's eyes shifted toward Emmett, who was still standing by the ram, his attention unwavering. He could see the glances that were being cast his way, the laughter, the judgment. And he knew exactly what was about to happen. "Yeah," Wade murmured into the phone. "I understand. I'll make sure they know." As the call ended, Wade took a deep breath. He had no intention of stepping into the fray. He wasn't looking for attention. But he also knew that Emmett wasn't a man who deserved to be treated like an afterthought. There was more to him than any of these men could possibly understand. The tension in the auction lot grew thicker with every passing minute. Emmett, however, didn't budge. His eyes remained focused on the ram, his expression unreadable. He knew this moment had been coming for years, and it was now upon him. When the officer reached him, he stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't need to introduce himself. Emmett already knew who he was. "Granger," the officer said, his voice steady and deep. "I thought it was you." Emmett looked up slowly, his face unreadable. "What brings you here, Captain?" The officer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the subtle correction in Emmett's tone. He had known Emmett before, back in the day, before the years had worn their way into their bodies, before time had taken its toll. But he didn't need to say it aloud. Their shared history was understood between them, unsaid but deeply felt. "We've been keeping an eye on you," the officer said. "We knew you wouldn't stay away forever." Emmett nodded slightly, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting them. After all, when you've lived the kind of life he had, you never forget the people who owe you their lives, or the ones you owe yours to. The officer's words carried more weight than anyone else in the crowd could understand, but Emmett wasn't here for an emotional reunion. He was here for something much more personal. The officer's eyes flickered briefly to the ram, his gaze flicking back to Emmett. There was something in that glance, something shared between them. It wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about the promise they had made, years ago, to never forget the bonds they had formed, the sacrifices they had made. "I take it you're still looking to buy something today?" the officer asked, his voice low and steady. Emmett's lips twitched into a slight smile, but he didn't answer immediately. His silence spoke volumes, and the officer seemed to understand. Emmett wasn't here for the truck. He was here for a reckoning. The atmosphere around the auction lot had shifted irrevocably. No longer was it a simple gathering of people hoping to strike a deal. Now, it was a spectacle, a tense, unspoken clash between men of power, history, and unacknowledged debts. The auctioneer, who had once projected an air of confidence and control, now found himself faltering. He stood at the podium, clearing his throat, his voice uncharacteristically shaky as he glanced at the military convoy parked at the entrance, and then at Emmett. The auctioneer, eager to regain control, glanced nervously at Emmett. He needed this auction to go smoothly. He couldn't afford to have it derailed by something he didn't understand. But before the auctioneer could respond, another man, an older figure, dressed in a suit with a silver watch glinting in the sun, spoke up. "I'll go $40,000, he said, his voice rich with arrogance, his eyes gleaming with the competitive edge of someone who relished a good challenge. Emmett's fingers tightened on the metal frame of the truck, and for the first time, he turned his gaze to the bidding war unfolding before him. He hadn't intended to participate in this circus, but something was stirring within him, something ancient and familiar. Without a word, Emmett stepped forward. The auctioneer, seeing him move, looked both relieved and confused, not sure whether to continue or halt the proceedings entirely. Emmett raised his hand. "I'll go $50,000, he said, his voice carrying over the rest of the chatter. The sound of his voice, calm and deliberate, stopped the bidding dead in its tracks. The crowd froze. For a moment, there was complete silence. Everyone turned to look at Emmett, disbelief written across their faces. The young man who had bid $35,000 gaped at him, his mouth slightly open in shock. The older man who had bid $40,000 frowned, his expression darkening. The auctioneer, recovering from his shock, looked from Emmett to the rest of the crowd, trying to gauge how this sudden change would affect the outcome. But there was no going back now. Emmett had made his move, and it had shifted the power dynamic of the auction in a way no one could have predicted. The young man, who had initially started the bidding war, was the first to recover. "You're not serious," he said, his voice filled with disbelief and a touch of anger. Emmett turned to him slowly, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm serious enough to buy what I want," he said simply. The young man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the older bidder, who was now watching the situation unfold with a mixture of caution and frustration. The older man made a slow gesture toward the auctioneer, as if giving his silent consent to continue. The auctioneer nodded, raising his voice once more. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, the bid is now at $50,000, he called out, his tone steady, though it lacked its previous enthusiasm. "Do we have any further bids?" But there was no immediate response. Instead, the crowd shifted uneasily, unsure of whether to continue with their bids or to step back in the face of the silent power that Emmett had just asserted. Emmett stood still, unwavering, his eyes locked on the ram. This wasn't just about buying a truck, it was about sending a message. As the bidding continued, something unexpected happened. Wade Michaels, the rancher who had been observing the scene from a distance, stepped forward. He had been watching the dynamics carefully, understanding the weight of the moment better than most. Without hesitation, he raised his hand. "I'll go $60,000, he declared, his voice calm but commanding. The crowd went silent again, this time in confusion. Wade Michaels. He wasn't the type to enter into bidding wars, especially not over something like this. But the look in his eyes told a different story. Emmett turned slightly, raising an eyebrow in silent acknowledgment of Wade's unexpected intervention. Wade met his gaze and gave a small nod. "I'll bid with you, Emmett," Wade said, his voice steady. "This truck's worth more than what they're offering." It wasn't just about the money. Wade understood the weight of the moment, and for the first time, he was standing alongside Emmett, not as a passive observer, but as a willing ally. Together, they were making a statement, one that went beyond the bidding war. The tension in the air thickened, and the crowd, now fully aware that something more was happening here, fell into a stunned silence. The bids continued to climb, but with each increase, Emmett's resolve solidified. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his place, and his legacy. The power dynamics of the auction had shifted, and the crowd understood that something much deeper was at play. When the bidding hit $80,000, the young man who had started the war finally threw up his hands in defeat. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, his pride wounded but his wallet intact. The older man, who had also been caught up in the excitement, hesitated. He looked at Emmett and Wade, then at the auctioneer, who stood silent and unsure. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he stepped back, conceding the auction to them. Emmett stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the ram. The crowd watched in awe as he made his way to the auctioneer, the decision now officially his. He had won, not just the truck, but the respect he had earned, the recognition he deserved. The auctioneer nodded solemnly, confirming the sale. "Sold," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, Emmett had reclaimed his victory.